Hey, welcome back to Wild Stories Daily. I'm so glad you're here because what I have for you today is something else entirely. Three stories, three people who were betrayed, humiliated, and written off. A daughter who gave 4 years of her life to care for her dying father and was erased from his will. A restaurant manager handed 47 pages of absurd rules and used every single one of them as a weapon. And a man who was thrown out of the company he built by his best friend of 15 years, who spent the next 5 years quietly becoming the most powerful person in the room. No screaming, no confrontation, no begging, just patience, intelligence, and the most satisfying justice you have ever seen. Stay with me. You do not want to miss a single second of this. Imagine spending 4 years cleaning wounds, giving baths, holding your father's hand through the night, while your brother only showed up at Christmas. And when your father dies, you find out you no longer exist in the will. Zero. Nothing, as if you never existed, as if those 4 years were invisible. But what if your father knew exactly what was coming and had prepared something no one saw coming? Stay until the end because this story will make you feel rage, pain, and one of the greatest moments of satisfaction you have ever experienced in your life.
My name is Rachel Simmons. I'm 34 years old. I've been an ICU nurse for 8 years. I know what it means to hold a stranger's hand while they die. I know how to look into someone's eyes and understand that this is the last time. I've done that hundreds of times at work, but nothing prepared me for doing that with my own father. My father, George Simmons, had his first stroke in October of 2020. I was 30 years old. I had just finished a 12-hour shift when my stepmother Diane, called me crying. But wait, I need to tell you about Diane first, because she is a fundamental part of this story. My father married Diane when I was 16. My biological mother had died 3 years before. Diane was beautiful, charming at family dinners, and had a son from a previous relationship, my stepbrother Kevin. Kevin Hartley, 6 years younger than me, a corporate attorney in Atlanta. Diane was never openly cruel to me. She was the kind of person who kills you with kindness, a smile in the wrong place, one extra word at the wrong moment. Rachel is so dedicated, she would say, with that calculated pause before dedicated that turned a compliment into a criticism. Kevin was different. Kevin was the son she had chosen, the attorney, the pride, the one who showed up at Christmas with expensive gifts and funny stories about famous clients. I was the nurse, the one who stayed. When my father had the stroke, I was the one who reorganized my life. I traded my apartment for a bedroom on the upper floor of their house. I reduced my shifts from 5 to 3 days a week. I hired, out of my own pocket, a physical therapist to come 3 times a week. Kevin sent a fruit basket. In the first 6 months, my father improved considerably. He started walking with a cane again. He went back to reading the morning newspaper. We spent hours on the porch together, him telling me stories from his youth that I had never heard before, about how he built the farm from scratch, about how he lost everything once and rebuilt it all. The Simmons farm, 847 acres in rural Georgia, land that his family had owned since 1962, valued the last time I knew at $2.3 million. My father loved that land with an intensity I never completely understood until after. In 2022, my father had a second stroke. This one was more serious. He lost part of the mobility on his right side. His speech became slow, drawn out. He would get frustrated with himself. A man who had managed 40 employees for 30 years, now struggling to say his daughter's name without faltering. Diane started appearing at home more during that time. Before, she traveled a lot. These spa trips I never quite understood how they were paid for, since she hadn't worked in years. But after the second stroke, she was always there. I should have paid more attention to why. 4 years, 2 months, and 18 days. I know the exact number because I counted afterward, not out of bitterness, out of precision. I'm a nurse. I count things. 4 years, 2 months, and 18 days of alternating shifts with home care. Of nights awake monitoring blood pressure, of fights with insurance companies, of conversations with neurologists, of holding my father when he cried with rage because he couldn't open a jar of jelly by himself. Kevin came to visit 4 times during that period. 4. Christmas of 2021, Dad's birthday in 2022, a cousin's wedding in 2023, and at the end, when it became clear my father was in his final months. My father died in March of 2024, a Tuesday morning with light rain outside, in a quiet and dignified way that he would have approved of. I was holding his hand. Diane was on the other side. Kevin had arrived 2 days earlier and was sleeping in the guest room. 3 days after the funeral, Diane summoned us to the living room to discuss the estate. I sat on the couch where I had spent 1,000 evenings watching movies with my father. Kevin stood near the window, arms crossed, with that attorney's expression I had learned to recognize. The expression of someone who already knows what is about to be said. Diane opened a folder. "Your father updated his will in November of 2023, she said. He wanted me to take care of the farm, and for Kevin to be the executor of the estate." I looked at her, then at Kevin. "And me?" I asked. Diane slid a sheet of paper in my direction, a single paragraph. My name appeared once. "Rachel Ann Simmons receives the sum of $10,000 and the personal belongings stored in the bedroom she occupies at the residence. $10,000, 4 years of my life. My career reorganized, my apartment abandoned, my health compromised. I had developed chronic insomnia during that period. I was on medication. All of that. $10,000. Kevin spoke before I could process it. "Rachel, Dad loved you very much, but he understood that you had a career, an independent life. The farm needs someone who can dedicate themselves to it full time. Diane and I have a plan to—" "You already sold part of it," I said. Silence. 3 weeks before my father died, I had accidentally overheard a conversation between the two of them, Kevin and Diane. He was mentioning the buyer for the north lot and closing before probate. Kevin blinked, once, quickly. "We were just exploring options to—" "How much?" I asked. Diane closed the folder. "This conversation isn't productive right now," she said. "You're grieving. We all are." I left the room. I went to the bedroom I had occupied for 4 years, which according to that will I now had 60 days to vacate, and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't cry. That's going to sound strange, but I didn't cry, because something was wrong. I knew my father. I had spent 4 years with him in a way that Diane and Kevin couldn't imagine. I knew how he thought. I knew what he valued. And my father was not the type of man who abandoned the daughter who stayed. I picked up my phone, called the only person who could help me understand what was happening. Margaret Cole, the notary my father had used for 20 years. "Rachel," Margaret said when she answered. There was something in her voice, a pause before she continued. "I was expecting your call. Your father told me you would call." I froze. "Can you come to my office tomorrow morning?" she asked. "There is something your father left, with specific instructions to be delivered only to you, and only if the official will was contested, or if you called first." My heart raced. "What is it?" I asked. "An envelope," Margaret said, "and a flash drive." Margaret Cole was 71 years old and had completely white hair that she wore pulled back in a tight bun. She had been a notary in that town for 42 years. She had registered my biological mother's birth. She had authenticated my grandfather's first farm contract. She had known me since I was 6 years old. When I walked into her office that Wednesday morning, She stood up, walked toward me, and hugged me for a long time without saying anything. Then she stepped back, looked into my eyes, and said, "Your father was a very intelligent man, Rachel, and he loved you in a way that words cannot contain." I sat down. She placed the envelope and the flash drive on the table between us. "In September of 2023, Margaret began, your father came to me alone, without Diane, without Kevin. He arrived by taxi. He told me he had asked the driver not to mention it to anyone." She paused. "He knew, Rachel. He knew what was being planned. He had heard conversations he wasn't supposed to hear. Kevin would call Diane when he thought your father was sleeping, but George Simmons never truly slept in those last weeks. He kept his eyes closed and listened." I felt my stomach turn. Kevin already had a buyer for the north lot of the farm 6 months before your father died. He had already consulted an appraiser for the rest of the property, and Diane had signed a power of attorney that your father would never have signed consciously, using a document notarized by an office in Atlanta that your father had never visited. Forged documents. That was it. Your father came to me because he had known me for decades and knew I wouldn't take that information anywhere until the right moment, Margaret continued. He recorded a video, he wrote a letter, and he created a second will, the real will, that was registered in federal court, not state court, specifically to make any local contestation impossible. She pushed the envelope toward me. My name was written by hand on the front. My father's handwriting, slow, slightly crooked from the stroke, but unmistakably his. I opened it carefully, as if the paper could break. "Rachel, if you are reading this, what I feared has happened. Forgive me for not telling you before. I didn't want to put you in the middle. You were already carrying so much. You were my real daughter, not by blood. Blood is just biology. You were my daughter because you stayed, because you chose to stay when it would have been easier to leave. The farm is yours, all of it. It was always meant to be yours. What happened with the will they showed you is a crime. Margaret has everything you need to prove it. Don't rush. Do it right. And don't waste your energy on anger. Spend it on what comes next. With love, Dad." I'm not going to tell you I didn't cry this time. I cried. A lot. But they were different tears from what I had expected. Not tears of sadness. They were tears of something that doesn't have an exact name. The feeling of being seen by someone who is no longer here to see you. After I stopped, Margaret placed the flash drive on the table. "The video," she said simply. We connected it to her old laptop. The screen opened, and there was my father, sitting in that same chair where I was now, his cane leaning beside him, white hair, face thinner than I remembered. But his eyes were the same, clear, direct, completely present. He looked at the camera and said, "My name is George Thomas Simmons. Today is September 14, 2023. I am in full mental capacity, and I am recording this of my own free will, without pressure from anyone." 12 minutes and 43 seconds. He described everything. The conversations he had heard, the documents Diane had mentioned, the name of the office in Atlanta, the name of the buyer for the north lot, the value of the transaction. And at the end, he looked directly at the camera and said, "Rachel, if you are watching this, I want you to know. I know what you gave up. I know what it cost. And I did not leave without making sure it was worth it." The attorney Margaret recommended was named Patricia Owens, 48 years old, a former federal prosecutor, specializing in estate fraud and crimes against the elderly. When I showed her the flash drive and the documents from the second federal will, she was silent for almost a full minute. Then she said, "They committed at least 4 federal crimes: notarial document forgery, estate fraud, financial abuse of a vulnerable person, and sale of property without legal authorization." Pause. "When do you want to begin?" I told Patricia one important thing from the start. I don't want them to know it's coming. No warnings, no dramatic confrontations, no phone calls. Let them keep thinking they won. Patricia smiled the way only people who have spent years as federal prosecutors smile, with a calm that is almost terrifying. That is exactly the right approach, she said. For 6 weeks, while Diane was beginning to receive visits from potential buyers for the rest of the farm, and Kevin returned to Atlanta thinking the matter was closed, Patricia and her team built the case. They located the office in Atlanta where the forged power of attorney had been registered. The notary at that office, when confronted with the inconsistencies, cooperated immediately. He had been deceived, too, presented with documents that appeared legitimate but contained my father's forged signature. They identified the buyer for the North lot, a developer from Columbus, who upon discovering that he had purchased land from a fraudulent transaction, became furious and became a cooperative witness. And they located 2 farm employees who had witnessed conversations between Kevin and Diane in the months before my father's death. Conversations they had never been asked about, but that had made them uncomfortable and stayed in their memory. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 7 weeks after my father's funeral, when Kevin received the phone call. It wasn't from me. It was from the office of the federal prosecutor for the Northern District of Georgia. Diane received a visit from 2 federal agents at 9 in the morning, while she was having coffee in the kitchen of the house she thought was hers. And the buyer for the rest of the farm, a businessman from Augusta with whom she had closed a deal the previous week, received a notification that the transaction had been suspended by court order. I learned all of this from Patricia. I was not present for any of it. I didn't need to be. Kevin tried to call me that day, 3 times. I didn't answer. He sent a message. "Rachel, we need to talk. This is getting out of control. We can resolve this as a family." I replied with 2 words, "Talk to my attorney." The process lasted 8 months. Kevin made a plea agreement with the federal prosecutor's office. He confessed to the forgery. He returned the fees he had received as executor. He paid a fine. He lost his bar license for 5 years, which in practice meant the end of his career, because the firm where he worked fired him on the same day the agreement was announced. Diane was convicted of estate fraud and financial abuse of a vulnerable person. She served her sentence in a semi-open facility. The house, which was in my father's name, returned to the legitimate estate. The North lot was recovered. The developer from Columbus, after considerable legal costs, was reimbursed by the estate, and the land returned to the farm. And the second federal will, my father's real will, was executed in full. Today, the Simmons farm has my name on the deed, all 847 acres. I hired an excellent farm manager to run the productive side. I built a small school for the children of the employees who live on the property, an idea my father had mentioned once, on one of those afternoons on the porch. I still work as a nurse, 3 shifts a week, because it was never about the money. It never was. It was about what that land represented and what my father represented. Kevin sent me a letter of apology a few months ago. I didn't respond. Not out of anger. I no longer feel anger. But because some things have no answer that changes what was done. What remains is what my father said in that video. Don't waste your energy on anger. Spend it on what comes next. I spent it, and it was worth every single second.
What if your boss created 47 pages of absurd rules to control you, and you simply followed every single one of them? To the letter, without questioning, without complaining, every rule followed perfectly. Sounds harmless, right? Wrong, because sometimes the most powerful weapon that exists is exactly what the enemy placed in your hands. Stay until the end, because this revenge has no blood, no screaming, and it is absolutely devastating.
I'm going to tell you about the day a man walked into my life with a brown leather folder. a smile of someone who had just been promoted. And 47 pages of rules he had written himself. My name is Maya Johnson. I'm 28 years old. I've been a shift manager for 3 years at Golden Fork, a fast casual restaurant chain with 17 locations across the southeastern United States. Our unit in Birmingham, Alabama, was consistently the second most profitable in the chain. Second. But almost always tied for first. I was proud of that. Real pride. The kind that comes from knowing you built something with your own hands. I had a team of 22 employees I knew by name, by nickname, by story. I knew who needed to leave early on Fridays because they picked up their child from school. I knew who was saving for college. I knew who had the talent to become a manager and just needed a chance. It worked very well. Until the second week of January, when the chain hired a new regional director. His name was Craig Dunwell. 42 years old. MBA from a university he mentioned every other sentence. He had spent the last 8 years optimizing operations at food chains in the Midwest, which, we later discovered, meant cutting costs to the bone, generating pretty numbers for 2 quarters, and moving on before the damage became visible. Craig arrived at our unit on a Tuesday morning with that leather folder and the energy of someone who had decided everything before seeing anything. He did a 40-minute tour. Didn't ask a single question. He took notes in silence. Checked his watch. Looked at the employees with that human calculator expression. I had learned to recognize in managers who had never actually worked a lunch shift in their lives. Then he called me to the back room, which in practice was a stockroom with a plastic table, and opened the folder. Maya, Golden Fork is going through a phase of operational standardization, he said. Each unit will receive and implement the new Manual of Operational Excellence. This document will define every process, every customer interaction, every safety protocol, and every standard of conduct. He pushed the folder toward me. 47 pages. Table of contents with 16 sections. Appendices. A glossary. Craig, I said, carefully, our unit has had the best numbers in the chain for 2 consecutive years. Our current system, clearly. Your numbers are good, he interrupted me, but they are not standardized. What is not standardized is not scalable. And what is not scalable has no future at Golden Fork. Pause for effect. You have 2 weeks to implement the manual in full. I will return for a compliance audit. Each item not implemented will be recorded as an operational infraction. He picked up the folder, placed it in front of me, and left. That night, sitting at my kitchen table at 11 at night with cold coffee and the manual open in front of me, I read all 47 pages. And the more I read, the more my stomach sank. Let me tell you some of the rules from Craig Dunwell's Manual of Operational Excellence. Because you need to feel what I felt. Shantres. Article 7. Every employee must greet each customer who enters the unit with the exact phrase, "Welcome to Golden Fork," where every bite is a golden moment. The greeting must be given within 3 seconds of the customer's entry. Every customer, 3 seconds, the exact phrase. In a unit that receives 240 customers during the lunch rush. Section 5, Article 12. No order modification can be accepted after the customer has confirmed the order in the system. Orders modified after confirmation will be considered new orders and charged in full in a fast casual chain, where half the customers remember they are allergic to something after they hit the button. Section 8. Article 3. Every shift manager must fill out the operational occurrence form, Model OOF7, for any deviation from procedure, regardless of severity. The form must be completed within 15 minutes of the deviation and filed in triplicate. Triplicate. Paper. In 2024. Section 11, Article 9. The maximum permitted time for table cleaning after a customer leaves is 90 seconds. Any time beyond that must be documented in the space efficiency form, Model SEF2, Section 14. Article 1. Employees cannot use colloquial expressions or nicknames when communicating with customers. Communication must strictly follow the approved scripts listed in Appendix D. Appendix D had 19 different scripts. For situations like customer asks for discount, customer complains about wait time, and I swear I am not making this up, customer asks about ingredients. I went to bed at 2 in the morning with one certainty. This manual, followed to the letter, would not optimize anything. It would destroy the unit in weeks. Delayed orders because employees were filling out forms in triplicate. Furious customers because they couldn't modify orders. Lines at the counter because everyone on the team was standing at the door greeting each person who entered with a 17-word phrase. Occurrence forms for every process deviation in an operation that has 40 deviations per hour, because that is the reality of a restaurant. Craig had written a manual that demonstrated, in 47 pages, that he had never actually worked in a restaurant. And then, at that exact moment, at 12 in the morning, I had a thought. A very quiet, very clear, very dangerous thought. What if I followed each one of these rules, exactly as written, without questioning, without adapting, without using the common sense that no manual can ever capture? What if I did exactly what he told me to do, but I needed to be certain of one thing first? The next day, I called Andrea Park, Golden Fork's Director of Human Resources. Andrea had hired me 3 years earlier. She was competent, fair, and clearly not a fan of Craig's new management style. Though she was too professional to say so openly. Andrea, I said, the manual Craig distributed, was it approved by executive leadership? A pause. It was. Reviewed by leadership, she said, choosing her words carefully. Craig has operational autonomy in his region, so it is a legitimate company directive. Formally, yes. Thank you, Andrea. I hung up. Formal, legitimate, approved, perfect. I called my team together for a meeting before the morning shift 2 days later. 22 employees. Some had worked with me for 2 years. I looked at each one of them. You all received a copy of the Manual of Operational Excellence, I said. Starting today, we are going to follow it, in full, every rule, every form, every script, every deadline. Silence. Denise, my counter-supervisor for 2 years, looked at me with the expression of someone trying to decide if they heard correctly. Maya, seriously, completely seriously, I said. Section 3, Article 7, every customer who enters receives the complete greeting within 3 seconds. Section 8, Article 3, Form O, 7 for every deviation. Ex 5, Article 12, no modifications after confirmation. Pause. Every rule, exactly as written. Someone in the back of the room made a sound. Half laugh, half disbelief. You'll understand, I said. Trust me. The first day of full compliance was a Monday. At 11:47, 3 minutes before the lunch rush, I was at the counter with Denise and for other employees. All properly positioned to comply with Section 3, Article 7, the door opened. A woman suit walked in, Finhan Cleary. 5 voices simultaneously, in perfect unison, welcome to Golden Fork, where every bite is a golden moment. The woman stopped, looked at us, looked at her phone, looked back at us. Thank you? Over the next 45 minutes, 238 customers walked through the door. 238 greetings in unison. Some customers loved it. They found it charming, took pictures, laughed. Others were clearly disconcerted. 3 asked if it was some kind of special occasion. But we followed the manual. At 12:23, Marcus, my best server, 21 years old, business administration student, came to me with a tense expression. Maya, the lady at table 6 wants to remove the onion from her sandwich. Referred the Section 5 Article 12, Samli. Order already confirmed cannot be modified. Show her the script from Appendix D. Situation 7. Customer requests modification after confirmation. Marcus looked at me, took a deep breath, went to the table with the tablet open to the approved script. 90 seconds later, the lady at table 6 came to the counter personally to complain. I filled out operational occurrence form OOF, -7 in triplicate. It took exactly 18 minutes because the form had 14 required fields and I filled each one with absolute precision while the line at the counter grew. At 12:41, table 12 was vacated. Denise started cleaning immediately. 1 minute and 43 seconds later, 53 seconds over the limit from Section 11, Article 9, she finished. I filled out space efficiency form SEF to in triplicate. By the end of the lunch shift, I had filled out 27 OOF7 forms and 19 SEF2 forms. 138 pages of documentation for a 2-hour shift. Filed in 3 separate stacks, exactly as specified in the manual. By the end of the first week, customer complaints had tripled. Not because the service had gotten worse. The food was the same, the team was the same, the cleanliness was the same. But because every interaction was stiffened by scripts. Every problem took longer to resolve because there was a form protocol for every situation. And the lunch line was 30% longer because half the team was synchronizing greetings at the door. Our average service time went from 4.5 minutes to 7 minutes. Our customer satisfaction score, measured by the chain's internal system, dropped from 4.7 to 3.9 in 7 days. I documented everything. Every number. Every complaint. Every form. A separate spreadsheet I updated every night, with timestamps and cross-references to each article of the manual that had been applied. In the second week, Craig Dunwell called. Maya, I'm receiving reports of declining satisfaction at your unit. I'm aware. I said, may I send you the complete documentation? I have a record of every deviation and a reference to the manual article that was applied in each case. Brief silence. That won't be necessary. Craig, the manual specifies in Section 2. Article 1 that all compliance must be documented and made available to the regional director upon request. I want to ensure we are also in compliance with that article. Another silence. Different from the first. I'll come by the unit on Friday for the audit, he said. Excellent, I replied. We'll be prepared. Craig arrived on Friday at 10 in the morning 1 hour before the lunch rush. And I had extended a special invitation. Andrea Park, the HR director, was there. I had called her on Wednesday and said only, Andrea, I think you'll want to be present at Friday's audit. There are some operational issues that may have implications for the company. Andrea was experienced enough to understand that was not a casual request. Thomas Okafor was there too. I had quietly sent him the spreadsheet with the metric decline, week-by-week comparison, with a note. I would like to understand if the new operational directive is aligned with Q1 financial goals. Could you be present at Friday's audit? Thomas had responded within 40 minutes. I'll be there. Craig walked in and saw Andrea and Thomas in the room. He blinked. Once. Andrea. Thomas. I didn't know you were coming. Maya invited us. Thomas said simply. I placed 3 things on the table. The Manual of Operational Excellence. 47 pages. The compliance spreadsheet. 116 pages documenting every application of every article of the manual, with timestamps, results, and cross-references, and an impact report. 12 pages. With the following data: customer satisfaction, 17% decline in 2 weeks. Average service time, 56% increase. Customer volume during the lunch hour, 23% decrease. Formal complaints, 312% increase. Monthly revenue projection at current trend, a decline of $47,000 from the historical average. And on the last page, a legal analysis of 3 specific articles of the manual. X5. Article 12. The prohibition of order modifications after confirmation violates the Alabama Consumer Protection Act. Section 8195, which guarantees consumers the right to modify an order before preparation begins. I said, we have 14 formal customer complaints referencing that article specifically. If any of them results in a lawsuit, the company is the defendant, not me, because I followed the approved manual. Thomas Okafor stopped writing. Section 14. Article 1. The mandatory scripts in Appendix D includes in situation. 11. An instruction to inform the customer that modifications are not possible for food safety reasons. That is technically a false statement in 13 of the 19 scenarios listed. A false statement to a consumer is a violation of the same statute. The room was in complete silence. And Section 8. Article 3 is the OF7 form in triplicate for every operational deviation generated. In 2 weeks of implementation, 2,308 forms at this unit. The manual does not specify who should process, file, or review these forms. They simply exist. If every unit in the chain implements the same way, the projected annual administrative cost is approximately $1.2 million in labor hours. For documentation nobody uses. Craig tried to respond. Maya, the manual is a general guideline that needs to be adapted to the reality of each. Craig. I interrupted him. With complete respect in my voice, you told me explicitly, and I have it noted with date and time, that every item was to be implemented in full and that items not implemented would be recorded as operational infractions. I implemented it in full. These are the results. Pause. If the manual is a general guideline that should be adapted, then it should not have been presented as mandatory. If it is mandatory, then these results are the direct result of the directive. Either way, I looked at Thomas. This is a conversation the company needs to have. Thomas Okafor looked at Craig for a long moment, then looked at me. Maya, thank you for the documentation. Can you give us a few minutes? I waited outside for 22 minutes. I could hear voices, not words, just tones. Thomas was direct and flat. Andrea was measured. Craig was defensive, then quieter, then almost inaudible. When the door opened, it was Thomas who came out first. Maya, can we talk tomorrow morning? I want to discuss some structural changes in the region that affect your position. Of course, I said. Craig came out seconds later. He didn't look at me. He walked through the restaurant, through my unit, through the unit my team had built, with his shoulders slightly curved, and walked out the front door without saying a word. Denise was at the counter. She saw Craig leave. She looked at me. I raised one shoulder. Neutral. Professional? She understood. The next morning, Thomas Okafor called me. Craig Dunwell had been reassigned to an administrative role without a regional team. In practice, demoted. The Manual of Operational Excellence was being withdrawn from all units for review. In practice, permanently shelved. And my unit, the second most profitable in the chain, almost always tied for first, was to receive a new designation. Operational Reference Unit, Thomas said. Your unit will be the model for the other 16. Would you have interest in a regional consulting role while maintaining management here? I paused, a calculated pause. What would the compensation be? Thomas named a number. It was 38% more than I was making. I'm interested, I said. There's one thing people don't understand about malicious compliance, about following absurd rules exactly to the letter. It works because arrogance has one specific blind spot. Craig Dunwell walked into my unit without asking me anything, without listening to anything, without understanding anything about how that operation worked. He knew about MBAs and spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations. And he thought that was enough to tell me how to do my job. The manual was physical proof of his ignorance. 47 pages of absolute certainty about a subject he did not master. All I needed to do was let him prove it to himself, with the very weapon he had placed in my hands. Craig Dunwell is today managing document compliance for one of the smaller units in the chain. No team, no region. Filling out forms. 4 to 7 pages of poetic irony. I'm at my unit. My team. With Marcus, who started business school last semester, I helped pay the application fee with my promotion bonus. With Denise, who is now operations supervisor. With 22 employees who know that when things get difficult, we don't run from the rules. We oozy them.
Imagine building something from scratch with your best friend. Sleepless nights, years of sacrifice. And on the day it finally starts working, he kicks you out, changes the locks, erases you from the story, and moves on as if you never existed. Now, imagine that 5 years later, he is desperate. His company is sinking, and he needs an investor. An investor he has never met, or at least that's what he thinks. Stay until the end, because this revenge was not planned on a day of rage. It was built in silence over 5 years, and it will make you smile the way only real justice can.
There is a specific type of betrayal that has no adequate name in the dictionary. It's not romantic betrayal. It's not family betrayal. It runs deeper than both, in a way that only those who have experienced it can understand. It's the betrayal of your best friend, the man who stood by your side through the worst nights of your life, the man who knows every single one of your weaknesses and chose, in one cold and calculated moment, to use exactly those weaknesses against you. My name is James Ellington. I'm 41 years old. I was a math teacher for 6 years at a public school in Nashville, Tennessee, and I was, for 3 years, the co-founder of an educational technology startup called BrightPath. I say was because in March of 2019, my business partner and best friend of 15 years expelled me from the company we had built together. That partner's name was Derek Walsh. And this story begins long before March of 2019. Derek and I met when we were 14, on a basketball court in the suburbs of Nashville. He was fast, competitive, and always knew exactly what to say to make you feel like the most important person on the court, or the most worthless, depending on what he needed. I should have paid more attention to that last part. We grew up together, studied at the same school, shared an apartment in college. He was the best man at my wedding to Sandra in 2011. I was there when he lost his father in 2013, when he lost his job in 2015, when he thought about giving up on everything. 15 years of history, the kind you think is unbreakable. In 2016, I was in my 5th year as a teacher. I loved teaching, with that intensity of someone who has found the right place. But I saw every day what the system couldn't do. Students who needed individualized attention that a classroom of 30 couldn't provide. Learning gaps that accumulated silently until they became insurmountable walls. I spent an entire year developing an adaptive assessment system, an algorithm that specifically identified where each student had gaps and generated a personalized study plan. I did this during evenings and weekends at the kitchen table at home, with Sandra sleeping in the room next to me. When I showed Derek, he was silent for a long time. Then he said, "James, this is a company." Derek had skills I didn't have. He was excellent at sales, at presentations, at convincing people. He knew how to navigate corporate rooms in a way that I, a public school teacher who wore the same blazer for 4 years, never could. His proposal was simple. I would build the product, he would sell it. 50% each. Equal partners. We signed a contract, registered the company. In January of 2017, BrightPath officially existed. The first 18 months were the most intense of my life. I continued teaching during the day. We needed my salary to pay the bills while the startup wasn't generating revenue. At night, developing. Weekends, developing. Sandra would sometimes ask me if I still remembered the way to our bedroom. Derek did the meetings. He presented to investors, to school districts, to educational foundations. He came back excited with stories of interest, possible contracts, promising conversations. In July of 2018, BrightPath signed its first real contract. A Tennessee school district, 14,000 students, a 2-year contract worth $340,000. That evening, Derek and I went to a bar we had frequented since our 20s. We ordered 2 cheap beers, the same as always, and sat in silence for a while, staring at the bottles. "It worked," he said finally. "It worked," I agreed. We toasted. I hold on to that moment because it is the last one I have with him, where everything was still real. Between July of 2018 and March of 2019, 8 months, BrightPath grew quickly. A second contract, a third, a seed funding round of $800,000 from an education fund in Boston. We hired 4 people. We moved from a makeshift office in Derek's apartment to a real space, with a reception area, a conference room, and a sign on the door. I had quit teaching in October of 2018. Finally, Sandra was pregnant with our second child, and I was, for the first time in my adult life, working full-time on something I had created. It should have been the best period of my life. But something was different with Derek. Meetings he didn't include me in. Conversations with the Boston investors that I knew had happened but I hadn't been invited to. Hiring decisions that appeared already made, without discussion. Once I arrived early at the office and found Derek and the company's attorney in a conversation that stopped abruptly when I walked into the room. I asked, directly the way we did, or thought we did, "Derek, what is going on? I feel like I'm being left out of decisions." He looked at me with that expression I later learned to recognize. The expression of someone who has already decided but is not yet ready to reveal it. "James, you are incredible at the product, but the company is growing into a phase that needs a different profile in management. I'm talking to the investors about the best structure for the next stage." "What structure?" I asked. "Nothing defined yet," he said. "We'll talk soon." Soon lasted exactly 3 weeks. It was a Monday morning. Derek asked me to come to the office early. The company's attorney was there, and an attorney I had never seen before, who, I later discovered, Derek had hired specifically for that meeting. On the table were 2 documents. The first was an analysis of a corporate restructuring that argued that, given the company's growth into an operational phase, the role of technical co-founder needed to be redefined. The second was an exit agreement. My 50% stake would be purchased for $175,000, paid in 18 monthly installments. In exchange, I would sign a 5-year non-compete agreement and a confidentiality clause that prevented me from discussing the terms with anyone other than my attorney. $175,000. for 50% of a company that had just closed an $800,000 funding round and had active contracts worth more than $600,000. I looked at Derek. He didn't look away. But there was something in his eyes. Not remorse, not exactly. More like the look of someone who has made a difficult decision and is waiting for the moment to pass. James, you will be well compensated, and you can return to what you do best, teaching, developing, without the operational pressure. I left without signing anything. The attorney I hired gave me a bad piece of news and a very bad piece of news. The bad news? The original co-founding contract had a clause that Derek or his attorney had inserted that allowed corporate restructuring by a majority vote of the board of directors. The board had 3 members: Derek, a representative from the Boston investors, and an independent third member that Derek had appointed 6 months earlier. 3-0. Decision made. The very bad news. Contesting it would take years, cost more than $175,000, and the exit agreement they had proposed was technically legal, as unfair as it was. You can try, my attorney said, but you'll spend the next 3 years of your life on a case that will probably end in a draw. I sat in that office for a long time after he finished speaking. Then I asked, if I sign the agreement, how long do I have to think before signing? No, they gave a deadline of 15 days. Understood. I signed on the 14th day. Sandra cried that night. Not just for herself, mostly for me. She knew what Bright Path meant. She knew what Derek meant. I didn't cry. I did something different. I picked up a notebook. I wrote the number $175,000 at the top of a blank page. And below it, I wrote one question. What do I do with this? I need to tell you what happened in the 5 years that followed. Because this story is not about anger. It is about what you build when the anger passes, and all that's left is clarity. I went back to the school where I had taught. They welcomed me back without questions. Good math teachers are always welcome. I used the mornings to teach and the evenings for what I had started calling, to myself, the project. With the $175,000 from the agreement, plus $40,000 that Sandra and I had saved, I started investing, not in random startups, in educational technology startups, specifically in startups developing solutions to the same problems that BrightPath solved, because I knew that market better than any professional investor. I had built the product. I knew where the bottlenecks were, where the real opportunity was, where most companies went wrong. My first investment was $30,000 in a 2-founder startup in Austin, EduTrack, real-time learning gap assessment. 6 months later, EduTrack signed a contract with the state of Texas. My stake was worth $180,000. I reinvested. I learned. I made some mistakes. I invested in 2 startups that went nowhere and lost $45,000 in total. I studied the mistakes with the same methodology I used to understand where my students were getting stuck. By 2021, I had made 7 investments. 3 had grown significantly. 1 had been acquired by a larger company. My stake converted to $340,000. But the most important thing wasn't the money. It was what I was learning about the market, about which products actually worked in the classroom, and which ones were beautiful in presentations, but useless in practice. About which teams had the right combination of technical vision and execution. About which companies would be great, and about which companies had rivals that were about to become much larger than them. In 2022, 3 years after leaving BrightPath, I received a message from a college classmate. Have you seen what BrightPath is going through? I had been following the company from a distance, with the coldness of someone monitoring a strategic situation, not with the pain of someone who had been expelled. BrightPath had grown well until 2021. Derek had raised a Series A of $4.2 million. The company had reached 42 employees, but the edtech market was changing fast. New platforms with more modern technologies were arriving, and the core of BrightPath's product, the adaptive assessment algorithm that I had developed, had not evolved significantly since I left. Because Derek was excellent at selling, not at building. In 2022, BrightPath lost 2 major contracts to competitors. The technical team had high turnover. I heard from former colleagues that the environment under Derek was difficult, that he took credit for others' work and publicly blamed anyone who made mistakes. 3 of the first employees had left. The company was alive, but it was bleeding. In September of 2022, I made the investment that changed everything. A startup called LearnFlow. 2 founders, Maya Chen and Roberto Santos, out of MIT. They had developed a second-generation adaptive learning platform that solved the problems BrightPath's original product had, but could no longer scale to solve. I saw their demo and knew within 15 minutes. I invested $220,000, 22% of the company. I joined the board as a silent investor. My name didn't appear in any public materials. It was a practice I had adopted from the beginning. Silent angel investor. No exposure, no interviews, no public presence. Partly for strategic reasons. Partly because the non-compete agreement with BrightPath had expired in 2024, but I had developed the habit of invisibility. And partly, I'll be honest, because there was something powerful about building an empire that no one could see. In 2023, LearnFlow signed contracts with 3 states. In 2024, it expanded to the international market. By early 2025, LearnFlow was valued at $31 million. My 22% stake was worth $6.8 million. And LearnFlow had just signed a contract with the largest school district in Atlanta. Exactly the market where BrightPath had its largest client base. It was not planned that way. I swear it was not planned that way. But when I heard about the Atlanta contract, I sat in my chair for a long time thinking about one thing. Derek Walsh was in Nashville, and BrightPath was at that moment losing Atlanta. The call came on a Thursday in October of 2024. It wasn't from Derek directly. It was from an investment consultant named Patricia Ewan, representing BrightPath in search of capital for a Series B. "We have a client seeking strategic investors in the edtech sector," she said. "Your name was referred by a source in the industry as someone with deep knowledge of the educational market. Would you be interested in an introductory meeting?" I paused. "What is the company's name?" I asked. "BrightPath, Educational Technology, based in Nashville." Another silence, longer this time. "Can you send me the presentation deck?" I said. "I'll review it and get back to you." I hung up, stared at the phone for a while, then called Sandra. "Sandra," I said, "do you remember me saying that one day Derek would need me?" She was silent for a second. "James, no. I haven't decided anything yet," I said, "but I want you to know what's happening." I read the BrightPath deck that night. It was well done. Patricia Ewan knew what she was doing. Numbers presented optimistically but not dishonestly. Technology described with terms that sounded modern, but that I recognized as essentially what I had built in 2016, with incremental improvements. And the risks that any experienced investor would read between the lines were all there. Loss of market share in Atlanta to an unidentified competitor. Technical turnover above industry average. Core product without significant architectural update in the last 3 years. The unidentified competitor was LearnFlow. I was the unidentified competitor. I replied to Patricia Ewan. "I have interest in a meeting. I prefer in-person meetings for this type of conversation. Can you come to Nashville?" She responded within 2 hours. "Of course, whenever is convenient for you." I scheduled it for a Monday morning, 2 weeks later. And I did not tell Patricia Ewan what I would tell you right now, that I was going to that meeting knowing exactly who was on the other side of the table. The question was whether Derek would know who was on mine. Derek Walsh walked into the conference room of my office, a small but solid office in downtown Nashville that I used for investment operations, at 9:02 on a Monday morning. He looked well. Gray suit, hair a little grayer, that salesman's posture I had known since 14 on a basketball court. He had Patricia Ewan beside him and a young analyst behind him. He saw me. Stopped for a fraction of a second, so small that Patricia didn't notice. I noticed. I extended my hand. Derek, long time. He shook my hand, firm, controlled. Those eyes I had known for 30 years evaluating me in real time, recalculating. James, he said, I didn't know it was you. Patricia didn't mention my name? I said with absolute neutrality. No, he said. Interesting, I said. Have a seat. The presentation lasted 42 minutes. Derek was excellent at it. He always was. Articulate, passionate, capable of making anything sound like an opportunity. I listened to everything, took notes, asked precise technical questions, the kind that only someone who had built that product could ask. Every question I asked, Derek blinked a fraction of a second, because he knew those questions came from inside, from someone who knew every line of code, every architectural decision, every limitation of the system. At the end of the presentation, Patricia asked, "Any questions before we discuss investment terms?" I closed my notebook, put my pen on top of it. Patricia, I'll be direct. I need a moment alone with Derek before any conversation about terms. Could you give us a few minutes? She looked at Derek. He nodded. Patricia and the analyst stepped out. The room went silent. Derek spoke first. James, I know what you're thinking. What am I thinking? I asked. That this is poetic, that you've turned the table. I paused. Derek, I didn't come here for revenge. I came because Patricia Ewan described an investment opportunity in the sector I know better than anyone. That's true. Pause. But I need to tell you something before any business decision. Because after today, I'm not going to talk about the past again. Just once. He waited. In March of 2019, you removed me from a company I built. You used a clause I should never have signed, with a board you assembled specifically for that purpose. In a process you had been planning for months while looking me in the eyes every morning. You knew what that company meant to me. You knew what I had given up to build it. And you did it anyway. Derek didn't respond. You don't need to answer. I'm not asking for an apology. I'm simply naming what happened. Because I think you've spent 5 years telling yourself it was a difficult but necessary business decision. And I want you to know that I know exactly what it was. Silence. Now, I'm going to tell you about the business. I opened my laptop, turned it toward him. On the screen was the LearnFlow portfolio. Metrics, contracts, current valuation. I watched the exact moment Derek understood. His eyes stopped on one point of the screen. His jaw became slightly tenser. LearnFlow is mine, I said simply. 22% board investor since 2022. You're the Atlanta competitor, he said. It wasn't a question. I'm the investor in the Atlanta competitor, I corrected. Important distinction. James, let me finish. My voice was completely calm. I didn't come here to destroy BrightPath. That doesn't interest me. But I also didn't come here to invest in it. Not at the current stage. Not with the current product structure. Not with the technical team turnover you have. Pause. What I came to do is offer you an option that Patricia Ewan doesn't know exists. Because it's not an investment. It's an acquisition offer. LearnFlow had interest in acquiring BrightPath's client base, specifically the contracts with school districts in Tennessee and North Carolina, markets where LearnFlow didn't yet have a strong presence. Not the technology, not the brand, not the structure, just the contracts. The offer was $2.1 million for the client portfolio. Derek would keep the BrightPath name, keep the team, could rebuild the product from scratch if he wanted to. It was a dignified exit for a company that, without new capital and without technical evolution, was 18 months from closing its doors. "Why would you do this?" Derek asked. "You could simply wait for us to sink and take the clients later, for less." "I could," I agreed, "but I don't want to." "Why?" I paused genuinely before answering. Because it was a real question and it deserved a real answer. Because 42 employees have nothing to do with any of this. And because I didn't build what I built to destroy things. I built it to create things. Derek looked at the offer for a long time. "And if I refuse?" "Therefore, then Patricia will find other investors, or she won't, and the company will follow whatever path it follows, but you and I will never sit at a table again. And if I accept, then we sign. And you and I never need to speak about 2019 again." Derek Walsh signed the partial acquisition offer 3 weeks later. $2.1 million, 42 jobs preserved. The Tennessee and North Carolina client base migrated to LearnFlow over 6 months, with careful transition to avoid any disruption to the schools. I was not present at the final signing. I sent my attorney. I didn't need to be there. There's one thing I learned in those 5 years that I can't completely explain, but I'll try. When Derek expelled me in 2019, the first thing I lost was the future I had imagined. The company, the partnership, the project. They were gone on a Monday morning with 2 attorneys and 2 documents. The second thing I lost, more slowly, was the version of myself who needed Derek to believe that it was possible. And it was when that second thing finally left, not in the anger, but in the clarity of the nights building alone, that I became who I am. LearnFlow is worth $31 million today and growing. I have stakes in 6 other companies. I went back to teaching 2 days a week at a public school in Nashville. My choice, not necessity. I want to be near students. I want to remember why I started. Sandra asks me sometimes if I've forgiven Derek. I think about the question honestly before answering. I don't hold anger, I say. But forgiveness isn't the right word. The right word is indifference. He has no power over any day of my life. That is better than forgiveness. She agrees, and on the shelf in my office, between the math books and the portfolio reports, there is a photograph. 2 boys on a basketball court in some summer of the 1990s. I didn't take the photo down. I didn't need to. But I didn't throw it away either, because those 2 boys were real. What happened afterward was also real, and both things can be true at the same time.